Almondsbury, England, April the 3rd, 1817. 8 miles outside Bristol, England. A farming village. Mud roads, stone cottages, a parish church tower you can see for miles. Nothing ever happens here. That's the whole point of a place like this.
In 1817, Almondsbury, England, was a place defined by its predictability. It was an isolated farming village where every face was known, and the social order was governed by strict, unspoken rules about how to dress and who to trust. That order was interrupted on April 3rd, when a local cobbler encountered a woman walking alone down a muddy road at dusk. She was immediately identifiable as an outsider. She wore a black turban wound tight around her head and a makeshift wrap dress, a splash of brilliant color that had no place in a rural English landscape. When the cobbler spoke to her, the disconnect became total. Her response was a stream of rapid, unrecognizable syllables. It wasn't English, it wasn't French, and it sounded nothing like any language the locals had ever heard. The village had no category for a guest they couldn't name. As neighbors gathered at garden fences to whisper, the cobbler's wife was left to provide a blanket and food for a woman who could not explain what she needed or where she had come from. With no way to identify her, the village moved her up the chain of command. She was sent to Knoll Park, the estate of County Magistrate Samuel Worrell, a man responsible for maintaining order in the district. Within the estate, 2 different views of the woman emerged. Samuel Worrell saw her as a vagrancy case to be managed, while his wife, Elizabeth, became fascinated by the stranger's appearance and mannerisms. Elizabeth watched for clues in the woman's behavior. She noted her perfectly upright posture, the unusual jewelry at her throat, and her refusal to use a bed, choosing instead to sleep directly on the floor. The Worrells used their education to test her. They tried communicating in Latin and French, and they used drawings to bridge the gap. Each attempt ended in silence or more unrecognizable speech. One moment of recognition occurred when the woman saw a hallway painting of a tropical fruit. She pointed at it and spoke a word the household finally understood: ananas. While ananas was a word for pineapple common across many languages, the discovery was limited. It proved the woman had traveled, but it failed to reveal her name, her country, or the reason she had appeared in Gloucestershire. As the days passed, Samuel Worrell's frustration grew. The linguistic tests had yielded no actionable information, and he was no closer to identifying the guest in his home. Worrell eventually turned to the only system he had left, the law. He officially classified the woman as a criminal vagrant, a label that allowed him to move her out of his jurisdiction. She was taken from the country estate to St. Peter's Hospital in Bristol. This was a grim holding ground, intended for the destitute and those with nowhere else to go. The arrest was a practical admission that the authorities were stuck. Unable to understand the woman, they chose to treat her as a legal problem and locked her away. The mystery quickly spilled out into the public. Within days, the gates of the Bristol hospital were surrounded by crowds of people eager to see the strange woman for themselves. Academics and regional linguists arrived at the hospital daily. They were confident that their knowledge of world languages would succeed where the village magistrates had failed. One after another, the experts were defeated. Despite their years of study, none of them could place a single sentence she spoke, leaving the city's intellectual elite at a total standstill. The situation changed when a Portuguese sailor named Manuel Eynesso stepped out from the crowd. Eynesso claimed he had heard this language before during his travels. He told the officials that he alone could translate her speech. With their own linguistic and legal methods exhausted, the local authorities were left with no other options. To get an answer, they had to rely on a sailor's story about pirates and a displaced princess. Manuel Eynesso hands her a country, a name, and a tragedy, and then he simply ceases to exist in her story. He isn't mentioned in week 2, and he won't be back in week 10. The man who gave her a fake identity has vanished into the city of Bristol. She is left in a foreign county with no allies, left to navigate the lie entirely on her own. Because her mentor is gone, there is no one around to document the truth. Her past has been erased, leaving her with a blank slate that she can fill with whatever details she chooses. This abandonment becomes her greatest asset. Without anyone to contradict her, she becomes the only person who can define who she is. When the Worrells take her back into their home, they treat her as royalty. She responds by rejecting every local comfort. She won't sleep in the beds they provide, and she refuses to eat bread. Her habits become more specific and demanding. When offered a prepared pigeon for dinner, she refuses it, demanding the bird be brought to her alive. In front of her hosts, she kills the pigeon, removes its head, and buries it with the blood before she will even consider eating. The act is visceral and strange, but it works. No one in the Worrell house has ever seen a real princess eat, so they have no way to judge if this behavior is actually royal or merely bizarre. She carries out every ritual with total, quiet confidence. In a house full of people who are looking for something extraordinary, that level of certainty is enough to stifle any lingering doubts. The story eventually moves beyond the estate walls. She is no longer just a peculiar houseguest, she is a regional celebrity, and the public begins arriving in search of a show. She gives them exactly what they want. She demonstrates expert archery and handles blades that she tells them are tipped with vegetable poison. At night, she swims in the lake on the property. She knows she is being watched, and she knows that every unexplainable thing she does becomes a new story for the local gentry to spread. She puts her strangeness on display, inviting the local gentry to watch her. By emphasizing how different she is, she builds a legend that makes her presence feel even more significant. Eventually, the educated men of the county want proof. They ask her for a sample of her native language, intending to send it to the scholars at Oxford for analysis. She doesn't hesitate. She invents an entire alphabet of unfamiliar symbols right in front of them, writing with a speed that suggests she has used these characters her entire life. A local doctor examines her and concludes that the marks on the back of her head are the work of foreign surgeons. He looks at ordinary scars and sees evidence of an exotic past, simply because that is what he expects to find. Once a man with credentials validates her story, the public stops asking difficult questions. The official seal of approval acts as a signal for everyone else to stop thinking critically. The gentry make one significant mistake. They assume that because she sounds strange, she cannot understand English. They speak freely when she's in the room, discussing their suspicions and exactly what evidence would convince them. She listens, adjusting her performance to address every doubt, and adds the fascinating details they want, just to convince them. The hoax succeeds because it gives the gentry exactly what they were looking for. She uses their own words and their own biases to build a story they are already inclined to believe. By June, the lie has survived for 10 weeks. She has successfully convinced a magistrate, a university, and the regional nobility that she is royalty. Her status is now cemented with a ball held in her honor and a formal oil portrait that captures her in her gold dress and turban. She has reached the highest possible level of fame for someone in her position. She is no longer a destitute woman. She is a figure of national interest. But this level of fame brings a new kind of danger. The more people who see her face, the more likely it is that someone will recognize her from her life before the lie. Her success means her image is no longer restricted to a single country estate. The newspapers are now carrying her story to a much wider audience. The printing presses are running, sending her portrait and her name into the streets of every nearby city. In a rooming house in Bristol, a woman is about to pick up one of those newspapers. She isn't a scholar or a member of the gentry. She is someone who remembers a woman with a very different name. The very fame that proved her story was a success has now created a trap. The more visible she becomes, the closer she gets to being caught. In early 19th century Bristol, Mrs. Neal runs a modest boarding house. It's the kind of place where servants and laborers rent a room for a few weeks before moving on. Like much of the city, she is following the newspaper coverage of the woman known as Princess Caribou. But as she carefully looks at the printed portrait and reads the description, she suddenly recognizes the face. 6 months earlier, a young woman named Mary Baker had rented a room from her. Mrs. Neal remembered her tenant frequently wrapping a black shawl around her head like a turban and practicing a made-up language when she thought she was alone. Mrs. Neal puts on her coat and travels to the Worrell estate, intent on identifying the royal stranger as her former tenant. The performance that had occupied the national press for 2 months was brought to a halt not by a detective, but by the memory of a working-class landlady. Mrs. Neal is brought into the Worrell house and placed in the same room as the princess. The two women lock eyes. There is a long, heavy silence in the room as the witnesses wait to see if the princess will maintain her exotic persona or defend her story. Instead, the act vanishes instantly. Mary stops the performance and begins speaking in her own voice, fluent, clear English, without any transition or attempt to stall. She admits she is actually a cobbler's daughter from Witheridge. The story of the island, the kidnapping, and the pirates is gone in a matter of moments. This map shows the connection Mary reveals next. She names Manuel Eynesso as an active co-conspirator who worked with her from the start. But immediately after this mention in the historical record, Eynesso permanently vanishes. He is never cited or seen again in any account. While the confrontation ended the hoax, it left a gap in the timeline that survives in every historical record of the case. For a woman in 1817 caught in a fraud of this scale, the expected outcome was immediate arrest and a vagrancy charge that would lead to public ruin. However, the reaction from the public takes an unexpected direction. The newspapers do not focus their scrutiny on Mary, but on the people she fooled. As seen in this satirical print from the era, the press began to mock the magistrates, doctors, and academics who had spent weeks being outthought by a woman with no formal education. Mary becomes a folk heroine. Instead of facing condemnation, she is honored in public poetry and becomes a subject of national amusement. She survived the exposure because her story offered the public the spectacle of the gentry being outwitted by a cobbler's daughter. In June 1817, at a busy harbor in Bristol, a large wooden sailing ship prepares for a transatlantic crossing. Mrs. Worrell, perhaps seeking to distance her household from the ongoing public embarrassment, arranges for Mary's safe passage to Philadelphia. Mary Baker boards the ship, stripped of her royal titles and returning to the status of a common traveler. But the stories of Princess Caribou have already been carried across the ocean by the international press. Mary is sailing toward a continent that is already waiting to meet an identity she has just finished discarding. When Mary Baker arrives in Philadelphia in 1817, she is already a viral sensation. Her reputation crossed the Atlantic faster than her ship did, and she immediately tries to leverage that international infamy into a paid stage career. The plan has a fatal flaw. A hoax requires the audience to actually believe the lie. Once people buy a ticket knowing exactly who they are watching, all the necessary mystery evaporates. 7 years later, she makes one last desperate attempt. By 1824, she is back in a London gallery, charging a single shilling to let visitors look at the famous Princess Caribou in the flesh. She performs to empty rooms. She had become trapped by her own character. Once the audience realized they were watching a performer instead of a mystery, they simply looked away, leaving her with a globally recognized name and absolutely zero future. While Mary's failure played out on public stages, her named co-conspirator was doing the exact opposite. Manuel Eynesso is formally recorded as her accomplice, yet the moment the hoax collapses, he completely disappears. Mary took the public humiliation and the useless fame. Eynesso walked away without a single arrest warrant, interrogation record, or confirmed sighting anywhere in England. Convincing an English county that a wandering woman was royalty is an impressive trick. A criminal successfully erasing himself from reality in the middle of a massive scandal requires genuine genius. The hardest part of the Caribou illusion to maintain was the Javasu language. Academics and magistrates spent 2 straight months actively trying to trip Mary up in conversation, and she never broke character. Creating functional gibberish requires a constructed linguistic system, a strict framework relying on grammatical rules, memory, and internal consistency. A rural cobbler's daughter with zero formal education does not synthesize that kind of architecture entirely on her own while under constant hostile questioning. The sheer survival of the Javasu language over those 2 months is the physical proof. Mary had an architect helping her build the lie. Eynesso provided the rules, handed them to Mary, and slipped away undetected. For a man who built the very foundation of the lie, to leave no trace in the historical record suggests a level of planning far beyond a simple spur-of-the-moment escape. The press in 1817 didn't care about the missing architect. They were completely addicted to the Princess Caribou character, so they simply started inventing new chapters for her. In September of that year, a newspaper claimed Mary's ship to America was blown off course to the isolated island of St. Helena. The article insisted she rowed ashore and completely charmed the exiled Napoleon Bonaparte. There is absolutely no naval log or letter from Napoleon's camp to back this up. It was pure fan fiction, printed specifically to sell papers to an audience that refused to let the story end. Compare that massive machinery of fake news to the absolute deafening silence surrounding the real mastermind. Nobody went looking for Manuel Eynesso. There are no shipping manifests tracking his escape, no police interrogations of his known associates, and zero journalists investigating the man who actually engineered the crime. The 19th century media decided they would rather invent a glamorous fake history for a fallen princess than track down a very real, very dangerous criminal who slipped right past them. Mary eventually returned to the working-class streets of Bristol. She married a man 10 years her senior, had a daughter, and settled into deep domestic obscurity. To make a living, she went into business importing and selling leeches to the Bristol Infirmary. She ended up as a medical supplier for the exact same hospital system that once treated her like exotic royalty. Handling parasites was the exact kind of gritty labor available to a woman in 19th century Bristol. She lived the most remarkable chapter of her life before turning 26, and spent the next 4 decades quietly surviving the aftermath. Mary Baker died on Christmas Eve, 1864. She was buried in a crowded cemetery, without a headstone, without a marker, and without a single physical inscription mentioning Javasu. By dying in complete obscurity, Mary permanently buried the origins of that language. She took the true identity of Manuel Eynesso with her, ensuring his escape remained flawless. The Caribou hoax serves as a case study in evasion. While the public focused on the woman who fooled the gentry, the actual mastermind achieved a perfectly executed, untraceable getaway. When a massive lie is finally exposed, the most fascinating detail is always the fraction of the truth that manages to walk away unnoticed. If Mary never told the truth, and Eynesso never resurfaced, where do you think he actually went? Channel Name digs up one story like this every upload cadence. We investigate the people who vanished without a trace, and the liars who wrote themselves into history. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one. If you want another story about a con artist who easily fooled the experts who should have known better, there's one waiting right here.